Hello again. It's been a long time since the last lecture. I hope you found other things to do while I've been away. Um, okay, what we're looking at today is there's going to be a lecture which goes with set number 7 of the exercises. Okay, so you need exercise set 7 later on, even though this is actually the 8th lecture, right? Because the last one there were no exercises. What you'll notice if you look at those exercises is that they cover 3 really quite unrelated, quite different topics. Okay, each of those topics we'll go through very quickly. There's not too much for each one, but there are 3 different ones. We'll go through them in the order that they appear in the exercises, just to keep it simple, although as I said, there's no real connection between them, so there's no real need to do them in any particular order. The first exercise that you have is connected with the passive voice. And I don't want to say too much about the passive voice simply because passives are something that you should do during practical classes, and you should all be able to make them anyway. So I'm not going to go into detail on how you make passive voice. We're just going to say 1 or 2 things which are connected with the things that we've been talking about so far. So of course we've been talking about parts of sentences, we've been talking about objects, and obviously when you make passive, you make the object of the original sentence into the subject of the new passive sentence. Okay, and you can do that with any object, whether it's a direct object or an indirect object. Okay, there are, however, a number of types of verb which don't take passives. And these are, I will give a list of these, I think, rather than reading them out on a set of notes. You get a second set of notes for the second part of the course. But there are things like verbs of measurement, okay, that we can't turn into passives. These tend to be, however, the same across languages. I mean, there are a lot of similarities between the passive in English and in Polish, so it's not anything too strange. The other thing, of course, which is important is that we now know about the difference between objects and complements, and we can't make passives out of complements, right? A passive is making an object into a subject, so you cannot make one out of a complement. So this is also a way of seeing the difference between objects and complements. Okay. Generally speaking, I'll just say very briefly something about the stylistic use of passives. Sometimes people think that passives are good because they are more, I don't know, more sophisticated, more complicated. Generally speaking, using the passive unless you need to use the passive is considered poor style. You shouldn't do it. You only use the passive when it has to be used. What I mean by when it has to be used, when it has to be used for your purposes, not when it actually has to be used. It's when you feel you can't say what you want to say properly in a different way. Okay, so of course we use the passive sometimes when we don't want to mention who the subject of the original sentence is, sometimes when we don't know who the subject is, and sometimes when the subject is simply very, very obvious. Okay, so we tend not to say that the police arrested someone, we tend to say someone was arrested and leave it at that because it's obvious that only the police go around arresting people. Okay, so there's always a choice to make when you use a passive, whether you should use the by phrase or not. And you will see that when you look at the exercise, you're supposed to put it in a passive and then decide whether to use the by phrase or not. Usually, as I said, we don't use the by phrase if it's very obvious. We can't use it if we don't know who the subject is, but we don't use it if it's very obvious. We don't use it, of course, when we want to hide, but that's something a little different from these examples. And also, we don't tend to use the by phrase very often with prepositions. Okay. You look at the prepositions. I didn't mean prepositions. I meant with pronouns. Sorry. We don't tend to use it with pronouns. With personal pronouns especially, we don't tend to say this was done by me. Okay, so that's quite an unusual construction. Normally that's not considered necessary. Okay, all right, so there are 10 examples of those in the exercise. You simply put it into the passive, decide whether the by phrase is necessary or not. If it's not necessary, it shouldn't be there. I mean, it always can be there. It's not that it's grammatically wrong to put it there. It's simply that we want to miss out anything that we can miss out. Okay. I think that's all I've got to say about passives. If anybody has any questions about passives, you can get in touch with me. It's not a very important part of the course. I just want to link it back to, just to make a link between the grammar, the descriptive grammar and the practical grammar that you have. That right, by linking back and saying that passives, we know more about objects, so we know about what we're making the subject of the passive, and we know that with complements that we can't make a passive form. Okay, that's that topic. Now the second topic that we want to look at concerns what we are calling multi-word verbs. Okay. Now very often at lower levels of learning, people talk about phrasal verbs. Sometimes people talk about two-part verbs, but a lot of what are actually commonly known as phrasal verbs are not actually phrasal verbs. So there are two different types of multi-word verb. Okay, basic types are phrasal verbs and prepositional verbs. Okay, so as you can guess, prepositional verbs are verbs where there is a verb and a preposition, and I do mean a preposition this time, a verb and a preposition. Whereas phrasal verbs consist of a verb and a particle. Okay. What particles are is one of those kind of vague things. Particles can be many different things. We're not going to worry too much about that. Particles usually look like prepositions, and that's where the confusion comes from. However, they don't behave in the same way as prepositions. So as you know, prepositions will generally want to stay very close to the noun which they are linking to the rest of the sentence. Okay. So that's how we will see some difference in behavior. Now, the difference between phrasal verbs and prepositional verbs from the practical point of view is not particularly important. They look the same and they're used more or less the same. However, they do behave differently when we start to move the word order around. Okay. Now, most prepositional verbs are actually very easy to understand. Okay. Because the preposition usually has its normal meaning. Okay? Usually has its normal meaning. Whereas, as you know, the problem with phrasal verbs is that this particle doesn't really have any particular meaning. So you can have different phrasal verbs with using the same particle, but the particle doesn't play the same role in each phrasal verb. This is why phrasal verbs are difficult to understand, because the meaning is not made up of the meaning of the two parts. Usually in prepositional verbs, the meaning is made up of the two parts. Okay? So there is a kind of question mark sometimes whether a prepositional verb is really to be considered one prepositional verb, or it's just a preposition and a verb. So if we take a construction like jump across the river, okay, we could say, well, is jump across, I mean, is that a verb, or is it just jump with across? Okay, so here across is working as a preposition. It means across the river. So jump across the river is perfectly easy to understand. So sometimes prepositional verbs, it's difficult to know where's the line between prepositional verb and just a verb and a preposition, and it doesn't matter particularly. However, that's not always the case. So some of the prepositional verbs are of this type that you can't really work out what they mean by looking at the two parts, and that's when you can have problems. Okay. So we'll just take an example, right? So you have very similar constructions. Take the phrasal verb and the prepositional verb. So there's a phrasal verb to call up. Okay. To be called up means, in the most common use, means to be, you get a letter saying that you have to join the army. Okay. So when there's a war, people get called up. Okay. There is a prepositional verb, call on. Okay. And call on, again, there can be different meanings, but let's take the basic meaning. Call on means to visit someone. All right. So I'm going to call on my grandmother. Okay. Now, this is a prepositional verb called on, but this on does not seem to be playing the normal role of the preposition on, right? It's not something on top of something else. So it becomes a little bit tricky. Okay. Now, what's the distinction? So the distinction is in the usage when we start to change the word order. Okay. So we can say they called up the man, and we can also say they called on the man. Okay. But very often we would say things like they called the man up. But we can't say they called the man on. Okay? Because on is a preposition, it has to stay with the phrase the man. Okay? It can't be moved to the end of the phrase. Whereas the particle in a phrasal verb can be. Okay? So if you start to think about other phrasal verbs, so you take something like look up a word in a dictionary. Okay? So you can look the word up, or you can look up the word. It doesn't make any difference. All right? So when it doesn't make any difference, that means it's a phrasal verb. So very often telling the difference between phrasal verbs and prepositional verbs will simply be a case of what sounds right. Okay. Now you might say, well, if you're not sure, then you can just forget about using this kind of construction. But it gets a little more tricky than that, because when we use pronouns, and I do mean pronouns this time, instead of nouns, then with phrasal verbs, we always use this construction where the particle comes at the end. Okay, so we can say they called up the man, or they called the man up. But when we want to say him, then we have to say they called him up. Okay, so pronouns always go between the verb and the particle. But with prepositional verbs, they can't do that. They can't go between the verb and the preposition. Okay, so then instead you could say they called on the man. You can't say they called the man on. That's nonsense. And you can't say they called him on. You have to say they called on him. Okay. So with prepositional verbs, it's always going to be like that. That the object is going to be after the verb. Right? They call on the man. They call on him, whether it's a pronoun or a normal nominal form. Whereas with phrasal verbs, okay, the object, if it's a normal noun form, it could be straight after the verb. It could be it could be straight after the verb with the particle afterwards, or it could be after the particle. But when it's a pronoun, it's always in between. It's always straight after the verb and before the particle. They called him up. Okay, so you can say look up the word or look the word up, but you can only say look it up. If you say look up it, right? Look up it would be like, there's a tunnel going upwards. Well, look up it, right? It would mean look up. So when we have this use of with a pronoun, if we have the pronoun after the second part, then that second part is always going to be understood literally, right? So look up will always be look up. It will always mean you're looking up, okay? Which is not the case with finding words in a dictionary, obviously. Okay. So this is the key difference between phrasal verbs and prepositional verbs. Most important, okay, in this is that you understand that there is a difference, and that you understand that the difference is there because of the way that prepositions work, right? That prepositions want to stay with the noun which they are linked to, whereas for particles that's not a problem, right? So there's a difference in the behavior. So when you get lists of phrasal verbs, in some books you will have a list of phrasal verbs, and some of them will actually be prepositional verbs, right? And they don't tell you that because they want to keep it simple, but in fact that can be quite, it could be problematic. And then if you want to explain why you put the pronoun in a particular position with a particular verb and in a different position with the other verb. Okay, so again, that's going to be easier when we look at a lot of examples. So when we go through the exercises, okay, you will see. And you will see that the ones which are prepositional are much closer to literal meanings, and the ones which are phrasal are often, well, they're further away from literal, so they're more sort of metaphorical type meanings. And you can probably assume that over time, what happens is you have a verb which is often used with a preposition, and it has an obvious meaning. And then as time changes, this set of two things becomes a prepositional verb and gets treated as one unit. And then finally, it starts to transform into a unit which actually has a different meaning from those two meanings, the two words which were originally joined together. And then it's no longer operating as a preposition, it's operating as a particle. That would be, we would assume that's how it happens in reality. All we know is that sometimes verbs are linked with particles and they behave in a certain way, and sometimes they're linked with prepositions and behave in a different way. And you'll see that as we go through the answers to the exercise. Okay. The third and final thing which I want to discuss with you in this lecture is very, very simple. Again, it's completely unconnected with what we've just been talking about. It's very, very simple. It's simply a question of remembering a little bit of technical vocabulary. So we're going to talk about distinctions between three types of adverbs or adverbials. Mainly we'll focus just on adverbs as a type of, the simplest type of adverbial, right? But this could apply to any adverbial phrase. Okay, so we can divide adverbials into three types. Okay, so you have to listen carefully for the names. The names are written down for you on the exercises so you can see them, as I don't have a board to write them on. But these are adjunct, conjunct, and disjunct. The names actually are quite self-explanatory when you think about it. We'll get to that in a moment. So adjuncts are adverbs, adverbials, which we can say this is the normal, standard, basic use of an adverbial. So an adjunct is an adverb which describes a verb. Okay, so when I say I ran quickly, this quickly is an adjunct, right? That's the standard use. So it's a sort of adjectival use. It's describing a verb. That's basic. Then you have conjuncts. Conjuncts are things which connect. So the con is explanatory. They are not conjunctions, that's something else, right? But they are also connectors. So these are conjuncts, so these are connecting adverbs. Okay. So if I say I ran quickly, then I jumped over the river. Okay. So quickly was an adjunct, it described how I ran, but then this is a conjunct. You can't start a conversation by saying, then I jumped over the river. Okay? So you can't start with a conjunct. Conjuncts only make sense in that they link back to what you've already said. So all these things like then, next, or later, earlier, all of these things refer to something which has already been mentioned. So they are joining this sentence to a previous sentence. Okay? So they are conjuncts. And finally, we have the category of disjunct, okay, which again, if you understand, the way that the word dis is used, or the prefix dis is used, this should also be quite simple. So they disjoin, so they are separate from the meaning of the sentence in which they are used. Disjuncts are a comment upon the meaning of the sentence. Okay, they are not part of the meaning of the sentence, they are a comment upon. So we use these very, very often when we say, hopefully it won't rain this evening. Or unexpectedly, I passed the exam. Okay, so these are all ways of giving an opinion. Very often they come at the beginning of the sentence, and that's useful because it lets the person that we're talking to know what we think about what we're going to say before we say it. So they know our attitude towards what we're going to say before we say it. Sometimes they come at the end. We say, it was a very nice party, strangely. Like, suddenly we realize that actually that was a little different from what we expected. But this is very, very common, and there are certain, sometimes people develop habits of using this type of construction very, very often, putting certain disjuncts at the beginning. And of course, we very often use a disjunct on its own as a reply. So someone says, are you coming this evening? And you say, hopefully. Okay, which is simply, instead of saying, hopefully I am coming this evening, it's you just shorten it and you only give the disjunct. So